तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात् ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. Namaste, my dear friends. Continuing the story of Sage Valkaya and his consort Maitreyi and Katyayani. Now, in this video, we will know about the knowledge of self and non-self. This is the important part of the story. The reader must now be prepared for a little metaphysical discussion which will occupy us throughout two chapters. He who has no liking for such discussions may leave these two chapters. Um, he who has no liking for such discussions may leave these two chapters and turn to the succeeding ones for the sequel of the story. But these dry chapters are not without occasional touches upon the character of the two wives of Muni Yajnavalkya, touches which may interest even unphilosophical readers. About a fortnight after Maitreyi's marriage, the Muni was one evening sitting with his wives in an apartment of his house which he called the Tapogriha, the chamber of meditation. The purpose for which it was set apart may be guessed from its name. The evening sacrifice was just over, and the house was yet full of the smoke rising out of the altar, and the odor of the incense burned thereon. The Tapograha, however, was a well-ventilated room, and the smoke soon left it and made its way towards the celestial regions for which it was intended. All the three persons present in the room seemed to await its escape with some impatience. They were not loath to give the gods their due. They indeed gave it with scrupulous regularity and punctuality, notwithstanding Yajnavalkya's somewhat hard feelings for the gods. But they were not contented with such ceremonials, and so having satisfied the gods, they now turned to their souls, which no sacrifices could touch, and sought their satisfaction in the unseen and untouched. It was Maitreyi who opened the conversation. Maitreyi, that subject must be taken up today. Katyani, what subject and what do you mean by the stress on your must? Yajnavalkya, Maitreyi wants an exposition of the unity of the self, and the stress on her must means that ever since her marriage she has been asking for a discussion of the subject, but for some cause or other it has to be put off. Katyani, why not first discuss the question what is the self before a discussion of its unity? Maitreyi, I have no need to inquire about the matter. Katyani, but I have. Tell me what the self is. Yajnavalkya, why not try to give your own answer to your question? Katyani, I think the self is that which has life. Yajnavalkya, what is life? What are its functions? That is, what do we do because we have life? Katyani, as having life was breath, air in and out. Yajnavalkya, eating, drinking, digestion, and the like are also functions of life. Katyani, then the self is that which breathes, eats, drinks, digests, and does such other things. Yajnavalkya, but suppose such a thing as you conceive, as you conceive as the self should feel no pleasure and pain, would you call it self? Katyani? No, in that case, I would call such a thing only living being but not a self. Yajnavalkya, then you see that your definition of self is incorrect. Katyani, I see I cannot call that a self which has no consciousness. Yajnavalkya, what is consciousness? Katyani, consciousness is knowing. Yajnavalkya, give example of knowing. Katyani, for example, my seeing you and Maitreyi and hearing what you say. Yajnavalkya, do you always see what you are now seeing and hear what you are now hearing? Katyani, no, I don't see you if I close my eyes or move away from this place and don't hear whether you are silent or when I close my ears. Yajnavalkya, but you continue to have consciousness even then. Katyani, yes, I do. Yajnavalkya, consciousness then continues even when the action of the five senses are stopped. Katyani, yes, it does continue. Yajnavalkya, what do we know then? Who or what is then the object of consciousness? Katyani, we then know ourselves. Yajnavalkya, consciousness then consists of knowing ourselves. Katyani, not in knowing ourselves alone, in knowing sensuous objects also. Yajnavalkya, but you have said that consciousness continues even when sensuous objects are not known. Katyani, yes, I said this. Yajnavalkya, but knowing ourselves is necessary for consciousness. There can be no consciousness without it. Katyani, I do not quite see this. Consciousness is sometimes concerned with sensuous objects and sometimes with the self. We sometimes know sensuous objects and sometimes ourselves only. Maitreyi, don't we know ourselves when we know sensuous objects? Katyani, we may or may not. Maitreyi, we must. When I see the money, I cannot but think that I am seeing him. Katyani, I don't know what sort of seeing you see. As for myself, when I see him, I forget myself altogether. The money could not avoid a smile at this compliment. It was this self-forgetful love of Katyani that enamored him of her. But he had also deep faith in Maitreyi's sincere reverence and admiration for him. Whatever Maitreyi did, she did with the fullest self-consciousness. She was a soul completely roused up, whereas Katyani had only just commenced to think of herself. However, the conversation went on uninterrupted. Yajnavalkya, well, Katyani, when you know only yourself and no sensuous objects, do you remember the latter? Katyani, yes, I sometimes do. Yajnavalkya, you remember having known them once. Katyani, yes, I remember having known them once. Yajnavalkya, that is, you remember yourself as having known them. Katyani, yes. Yajnavalkya, how is it that you remember something which you did not know? Katyani, did not know. What did I not know? Maitri, did you not say that sometimes in knowing sensuous objects you did not know yourself, and that in seeing the money you forget yourself? Katyani, yes, I did say that. But what inconsistency is there in saying that though I forgot myself sometimes in knowing other objects, I yet remember myself afterwards? Maitri, one cannot remember what one never knows. Recollection is only the reappearance of knowledge. Katyani, do you mean to say that because in knowing sensuous objects I did not know myself as their knower, therefore it is impossible for me to remember myself as their knower? Maitreyi, yes, that is what I mean. And since in remembering sensuous objects you do remember yourself as their knower, it is proved that you do know yourself as their knower when you perceive them. Katyani, oh, I see. But it is rather strange, and I cannot make up my mind finally on the matter before thinking more about it. I cannot meet your argument, but how is it that, though, as you say, we know ourselves in every act of knowledge, we do not always think, I am seeing, I am hearing? Maitreyi, we do not indeed think these words, but their purport is always present in our consciousness. I heard often from the Muni in my father's house before my marriage that there could be no knowledge without self knowledge, however dim and crude it may be. Katyani, I too heard all this from him before but did not understand it, nor do I see now, even though I understand it, its relation to the main subject of our conversation. Maitreyi, the connection is this. You said after you had defined the self for the second time that the self might know either sensuous objects or itself. You now see that knowing the self is the fundamental essential knowledge, since in knowing sensuous objects also we know the self and we know it even when we do not know the former. Katyani. Then it seems there are two kinds of knowledge, the knowledge of self, which is constant, and the knowledge of sensuous objects, which is changeful. Maitreyi, why do you call the knowledge of objects changeful? Katyani, because it is not always present with us. When I see the Muni, I do not always see you, and when I see you, the Muni may be absent from me. Maitri, but the knowledge of objects unseen and forgotten recur to us. Things that I knew yesterday and forgot, I know again today and remember them to be the same objects I know yesterday. Does not this show that the knowledge of objects is as permanent as the knowledge of the self? Katyani, but the knowledge of objects go and come, while the knowledge of the self is constant. Yajnavalkya, with the passing away of the knowledge of a particular object, our knowledge of the self as the knower of that object also passes away. In this way, the knowledge of the self is seen to be as changeful as that of objects, Maitreyi. But in knowing a fresh object, I know myself as the same self that knew other objects before. So that self-knowledge in both the acts is constant. Yajnavalkya, in the case cited by you, the knowledge of objects is as constant as self-knowledge. In knowing the unity of the self in two succeeding acts of knowledge, the objects of knowledge in the two acts must be brought together in the thought. Maitreyi, but in dreamless sleep we forgot objects altogether, but we know the self nevertheless. Yajnavalkya, if we forget the world, we forget the self also. That is, we do not know ourselves. When we know ourselves again, we know objects also. What we usually call self knowledge is as inconstant and subject to lapse as the knowledge of objects. Maitreyi, I am in greater confusion than I ever was. From what you say, everything seems to be hopelessly changeable and even destructible. The self can exist only as a knower. But if we lose self knowledge and the knowledge of objects, In dreamless sleep, how does the self exist? On the other hand, if knowledge is suspended in dreamless sleep, how does it reappear in the waking state? Yajnavalkya. Your confusion arises from confounding the real self, Atma, with the sensorium, Manas, which is in a sense one with the self and in another different from it. The changes in the question are changes not of the self but of the Manas. Katyani, what is the Manas and how is it both one with and different from the Atma? Yajnavalkya. The changes we have been speaking about must be said to be the change of something. They must be the states of a substance. That substance is not the self. For everything exists permanently in the self, as you see from the reappearance of everything in the waking state. We therefore imagine and cannot but imagine another substratum for these changes and call it the manas. In this respect, the manas is different from the atma, but we must think of everything as necessarily related to the self and forming a part as it were of the atma. In this respect, then the manas as the substratum of everything is one with the atma. Maitreyi, I see now how my doubts are cleared. In that great assembly, you described the self as the inner ruler, antaryamin of all things. In naming different objects as examples, you named the manas as one. I remember your very words. You said, Yo manasi tishthan man solvantra yu mano na veda yasha manaha sriram yo nano hantaro yamayat soyesa ta atmanam antriyamintaha. Translation is he who, though existing in the manas, is yet different from the manas, whom the manas does not know, whose body the manas is, who existed in the manas rules it. He is yourself, the inner ruler, the immortal. That the self is that ruler of the earth, of water, fire, and such other objects. I understood very well, but that like other objects, the manas also is unknowing, dependent, and ruled by the self. I did not understand then, but I understand this now. He is yourself, the inner ruler, the immortal. That the self is the ruler of the earth, of water, fire, and such other objects. I understand very well, but that, like other objects, the manas also is unknowing, dependent, and ruled by the self. I did not understand then, but I understand this now. Katyani, should we not stop here tonight? It is getting late. Maitreyi, the answer to my question is yet as far as ever. It is only your question that has been answered. We have seen that the self is conscious by nature and that its consciousness is constant, unchangeable. We have also seen that it is different from the manas. My question is, how do we know that the same self is in all? We seem to have a distinct self in every one of us. Yajnavalkya. When you know the real self, you will know it is necessarily one and infinite. The distinction between finite selves are not distinctions in the pure infinite self, but in the cognitional self, Vijyan, Vijnanatman or Vijnanam. Katyani. What do you mean by the Vijnanatman or Vijnanam, Maitreyi? I also have to know this. In your exposition of the Antaryamin in the Great Assembly, you distinguish the Atma as well as from the Vijnanam as from the Manas. I have understood the difference between the Atma and the Manas, but I don't see what difference there is between the Atma and the Vijnanam. Katyani, how do you remember so many things? Perhaps you can repeat the Muni's every words. Maitreyi, yet I can, but I deserve little credit for this because in order to make his exposition impressive, the Muni used almost the same words in every part of it. About the Vijnanam, he said, Yo Vijnane Tishthan Vyanadar Yam Vijnanam Na Veda Yasha Vijnanam Sariram Yo Vijnana Mantra Yama Yatra Yeshata Atmantra Yam Yamritaha. Translation. He who, though existing in the Vijnanam, is yet different from the Vijnanam, whom the Vijnanam does not know, whose body the Vijnanam is, who existing in the Vijnanam rules it, he is yourself, the inner ruler, the immortal. I now wish to know how the Vijnanam is distinguished from the pure self. Katyani, tell us first what the Vijnanam is and how we know that there is such a thing in every one of us. Yajnavalkya, I should be very glad to explain everything to you, but it would be very late before you would find any satisfaction from my exposition. Are you prepared to sit down? Maitreyi, I am quite prepared. I can sit up the whole night. Katyani. I can't say the same thing of me. I already feel tired and sleepy. Maitreyi, why not go to rest and let me talk a little longer with Damani? I shall tell you tomorrow what we talk about. Katyani, I shall not be satisfied unless I hear every word. And so, better stop here and go to rest. Besides, I have got something else to talk about with the Muni before I sleep. Maitreyi took the hint and let her co-wife retire with her husband while she, as was her habit, sat meditating in the tapo graha till a late hour on all that she had heard from the sage. The sage's bodily presence was with Katyani, but his spirit remained with Maitreyi. Next chapter, number 4. The individual and the universe self. Next evening, the discussion was resumed, the sage himself opening it thus. You can very well see that the unity of the Atma will be clear if it can be shown that what every one of us can call ourself is also the self of the world. But how can we know that the individual and the universal self are identical? As I told you yesterday, the real self, the self of the universe, has only to be known to be recognized as one. Now, next chapter, the individual and the universal self. Next evening, the discussion was resumed, the sage himself opening it thus. You can very well see that the unity of the Atma will be clear if it can be shown that what every one of us call ourself is also the self of the world. But how can we know that the individual and the universal self are identical? As I told you yesterday, the real self, the self of the universe, has only to be known to be recognized as one undivided. It is because people don't know it that they don't recognize it as one in all persons and things. Let me see whether you have any knowledge of Paramatmam or he is to you only an object of belief as he is to most people. Maitreyi, I have often heard that everything is Brahma, and I have a vague notion that whatever we know at any moment, we know along with it the universal self in which it exists. But I don't know how far I shall be able to explain my notion. Katayani, try to explain it as much as you can. Yajnavalkya. Our yesterday's conversation will help us. Tell me whether you know anything else in knowing this room. Maitreyi, in knowing the room, I know myself as knowing it. Yajnavalkya, but you know that the room exists in the universal self, or rather believe that it does so. Maitreyi, yes, I believe it, but do not understand it. Yajnavalkya, you will understand it by and by. Tell me now if you have any other notion of the room than as a known thing. Maitreyi, it is a known thing now, but it may sometimes remain unknown. Yajnavalkya, does it remain exactly as it is now when it is unknown? Maitreyi, it remains exactly the same. Yajnavalkya, but it is known now, seen, touched, or both. Does it continue to be all this? Maitreyi, it must, but I see that in saying that a known thing continues to be exactly what it is, even when unknown, I contradict myself. Yajnavalkya, you certainly do, and so do all who do not know the world as it really is. Maitreyi, then I must say that the room must always be conceived as known. Katyani. But suppose we say that the room, when unknown, retains its other properties but changes only its knownness. Maitreyi, how could that be? All the properties of the room are known properties. The room with all its properties is a known thing, and I see we have no other notion of it than as a known thing. Yajnavalkya, then you must think of the room as always known by you. You have no other notion of it, you say. Maitreyi, not necessarily by me, it may be known by others. Yajnavalkya, but it is in your knowledge now. Maitreyi, yes, it is. Yajnavalkya, every part of it is in your consciousness. Maitreyi, yes, every part of is in my consciousness. Yajnavalkya, and your consciousness is yourself. Maitreyi, yes. Yajnavalkya, then the room is in yourself or yourself is in the room. Maitreyi, so it would seem. Maitreyi, and the room will always be as you know now, know it. The and the room will always be as you now know it. Maitreyi, certainly. Yajnavalkya. That is, it will continue to be in yourself, or yourself will continue in it, even when your body is away. Maitreyi, I see, I must admit all this, but how strange it seems. Yajnavalkya, the strangeness results from the fancy which people have that when they know things, they bring their self to those things and take their self away from them when they are absent from them. Whereas the fact is that in knowing things, we discover the self in them, the self which contains or sustains the things and which is common to them and us. Maitreyi, how much I learn from these few words of yours, Katyani. You say that in knowing things, we discover the self in them. It therefore exists in them even before we know it in them. Yajnavalkya, certainly it does. Katyani, and as such it is the Visvatman, the cosmic self. Yajnavalkya. Yes, as such it is the Visvatman, Maitreyi. And is it also the Sutratman, the thread of binding self that you spoke of the great assembly? Yajnavalkya. Yes, it is the Sutratman that I spoke of, but my exposition of the Sutratman, Sutratman in the great assembly was rather superficial. Maitreyi, explain to us more clearly now. Yajnavalkya, you are already on the way to understanding it. Think and say how it binds together things. Maitreyi, it binds together me and the things I know. It is both in me and in them. It is both the self in them and my own self. How agreeably surprised am I to see that I am obliged to repeat almost your own words in the assembly. Katyani. How does it bind together you and me? How can I know that myself is yourself? Maitreyi, in knowing the world, you know that the Visvatman is the same as your Atman. My knowledge of the world reveals to me the unity of myself with the self of the world. It therefore follows that the self in you and me is the same. Katyani, I see. But there are differences also between you and me. How to explain these? Yajnavalkya. They will be explained when I explain the Vijnanatman. Vijnanatman. Now tell me what more you know about the Sutratman. Maitreyi. The Sutratman seems to bind together different parts of space. In knowing and thinking of different parts of space as connected, I know them and think of them as existing in one knowing self. Yajnavalkya. And you know that all parts of space are connected and particular spaces being contained in one individual space. Maitreyi. I know it, and does it not follow from it that the Visvatman or Sutratman is one and undivided? Yajnavalkya. Certainly it does. How wonderfully you know, follow up my hints. The Vish Atman you see is in all space, or rather, all space is in him. In other words, he is beyond space, that is, beyond the divisions of space. But please go on. Maitreyi, it seems to me again that the universal self binds together different periods of time, for it is the unchanging witness of events following one another. Yajnavalkya. Quite so, and you see therefore that the universal self is beyond time or eternal. Katyani, do you mean that he is eternal because he does not change? Whose are the changes in nature then? Maitri, all changes are changes of manas. Katyani, but the manas in us is limited. Cosmic changes cannot be its changes. Yajnavalkya, we must suppose, therefore, you see a cosmic minus as the substratum of cosmic changes. Katyani, but does not the universal self change when he knows cosmic events? Yajnavalkya, knowledge is not a change but a permanent prosperity of the self. As Maitreyi said, the universal self is the changing witness of events. The knowledge of events is not itself an event. From this, it follows that the knowledge of events exists in the universal self even before and after the happenings of events. To him, there is no distinction of now and then, as there is no distinction of here and there. Maitreyi. And therefore, it is that things that passed out of our minds and remain absent from us from for a time come back to us and show that they existed all the while. Katyani. But is not our knowledge a change? When I know this room, I pass from the state of ignorance to that of knowledge, and so there is a change. Maitreyi. But the knowledge of the room exists in the universal self even before we know it. To him, it is not an act but a property or his very nature. Yajnavalkya. Of him, it cannot be said that he knows, but only that he is knowing. He is akarta, niskriya, non-agent, non-active, Katyani. But what happens when we know the room or any other thing? Does not myself act then? Is not its knowledge an action? Yajnavalkya. Here you come in sight of the Vijnanatman. The universal self as universal does not act, does not change. The knowledge of everything and every event exists in him as his very essence. But when, in some mysterious way, he differentiates, as it were, a part of his essence as an individual self, this individual self appears as an agent, as knowing something it did not know before, as coming to know itself from a state of ignorance of itself. The universal self, as such, a differentiated individual, is called the Vijnanatman. In essence, it is identical with the universal, but as knowing the contents of the universal in parts, in particular spaces and times, it is as it were different from the universal. Maitreyi, your exposition leaves nothing to be desired. I have no more doubts at present to be resolved. The difficulty lies in shaking off your preconceived notions. One of the most hardened of these notions is that in the world we have only sensuous objects. that in knowing the world we know only such objects unrelated to any self. But you made it clear to us in yesterday's conversation that whatever we may know, we necessarily know the self along with it, that nothing can be known apart from the self. Today's conversation has made it clear to me that we cannot think of objects apart from the self. That when we think of objects, we really think of them as related to the self or in the self. The conclusion also is clear and irresistible that we really believe the world to be in the self and cannot possibly believe otherwise. Though we make a strange mistake in giving expression to our belief, as I did when I said that I could think of the room as existing unknown. Katyani, how you gather together in brief all the threads of the argument and help my dull intellect to grasp its drift. What could I have done without you, Maitreyi? She could not bear to be praised and was annoyed at it. You must not quarrel with me, especially at such a moment. Say rather, if you have got any difficulties to be removed. Katyani, I was just saying that you had helped me in my difficulty by putting the argument in a nutshell. We know the world in the self, we think the world in the self, and therefore we cannot but believe the world to be in the self. A selfless world, I see, is something which we neither know nor think nor really believe. We only speak of it, it is something made merely of words. As the theologians say, I now understand what they mean by the phrase Yajnavalkya. I am very glad to see, Katyani, that you have got the clue to the whole thing. What more have you to ask now, Maitreyi? I was speaking of the difficulty of shaking of preconceived notions. I have mentioned one of them. The other is that we habitually think of the self in us as a small thing and cannot get ourselves to think that it is as large as the world, or rather larger than the world, for it transcends time and space. But you have given us the clue to the removal of this difficulty also. You have shown that our self has two characters, universal and individual. As universal as the Paramatman, it is infinite and comprises everything. As individual as the Vijnatman, it is finite, it knows only a part of the universe. The distinction immensely helped me in my difficulties. In individualizing himself as the Vijnanatman, the infinite draws a cordon as it were round a part of his knowledge and thereby practically limits himself. When I think of the matter in this way, I understand, though only indistinctly, why I, though one in a sense with the infinite, am so ignorant and powerless. But our habitual belief that we are independent of the infinite is very difficult to shake off. Yajnavalkya, you will find it easier to shake it off if you remember two more things. One is that the cordon you speak of is widened and ever and anon as we know things unknown to us before. This continual widening of the cordon shows us afresh now and again that we are one with the universal self and in constant communion with Him. The other thing to be constantly thought of its dreamless sleep, which by suspending our seemingly independent existence and drawing us back into the infinite constantly reminds us of our entire dependence on him. Maitreyi. The hints are very valuable and will be of great help to me. Katyani, have we not got enough for today and should we not retire now? Maitreyi, we have got enough not only for today but for many a day. But I cannot go to bed now. I must, before I do that, think of the strange things I have heard from the Muni and try to understand them as much as I can. You have my permission if it were at all needed to retire with the Muni. Katyani and the sage retired. Maitreyi sat on meditating as usual, but something unusual happened that night. Meditating on the lines laid down by her preceptor, she obtained a direct vision of the infinite and eternal, and her soul was filled with the joys of direct communion with the divine being. She felt even at the first touch of these joys that they were incomparable to the pleasures of the world, even in their intensest form. Henceforward, she pursued these joys with an unshaken constancy and gradually purged her soul of these worldly desires that obstruct our progress and our final liberation and union with the eternal. When her husband retired from the world at an advanced age, she was so much free from worldly desires that, as we read, she declined any share in his worldly goods and wished only to have instruction on immortality, declaring, "What shall I do with that by which I cannot become immortal?" What you know of that, sir? Please explain to me clearly. Next chapter is the school of Janakpur. We have seen something of Yajnavalkya as a husband and the preceptor of his wives. We shall now have a glimpse, nothing more than a glimpse of him as a public teacher. His fame as a teacher of the Vedas had brought such a large number of Vedic students to him that he could not board them in his own house as was the custom in those days. He had a large boarding house built for them with the king's munificent help near his own house. The students lived there under the immediate care of Yajnavalkya's assistants while he superintended the arrangements and taught his pupils at stated hours. The scholars belonged to all the three twice born castes and were gathered from all ranks of society, including princes of royal blood on the one hand and sons of common traders, artisans, and farmers on the other. But all were treated alike and had the same comforts, hardships, and duties. They had the same kind of food, the same kind of bedding, and the same kind of athletic sports, except in the case of those who, in addition to their academic studies, received training as warriors. The rigors of the modern distinction of caste were unknown. The students all ate and drank together and behaved with one another as perfect equals. The division of profession indeed made caste marriages the universal order of the day, but intercaste marriages were frequent, especially those of the Anulama class, that between a male of a higher caste and a female of lower caste. The, the practiloma kind that between a higher caste female and a lower caste male was less frequent but by no means unknown. The Akshtriya chiefs, for example, Yayati had sometimes Brahmana wives, and at the Swayamvaras of Aksatriya girls, caste restrictions were systematically disregarded, so that among the students of the different castes in Yajnavalkya school, many were related to one another by both blood and marriages, and the foundation of many a relationship was being laid in the warm, youthful friendship that grew up as in a fertile soil under a common hospitable roof. Though Yajnavalkya's name is specially connected with the Yajurveda, he was well versed in all the three Vedas, Rig, Saman, and Yajus, that were taught in those ancient days and gave lessons in all the three. There were also chairs, as we would now say, for all the six Vedangas in his school, but naturally Yajnavalkya's lectures on the Shukla Yajurveda attracted more pupils than those on the other Vedas or Vedangas. One morning, several years after Yajnavalkya's marriage with Maitreyi, he was teaching the Shukla Yajurveda to a class of about 100 pupils when something happened which has a bearing on what we shall see in our next chapter and which therefore we must relate now. Yajnavalkya had lectured for about half an hour when he was somewhat disturbed by a deep rumbling of carriage wheels at the gate of the schoolhouse. Almost immediately after the porter present himself presented himself to the teacher and announced the arrival in his big chariot drawn by four horses of the general accompanied by a fine young man. The general was no other than our old friend Yajnadatta, already introduced to the reader as one of the two Kshatriyas who saved Yajnavalkya's life. During the years that had followed that event, he had by his many virtues, especially by his military skill and heroism, risen in the king's favor and been promoted by gradual steps to the highest military post at his majesty's disposal, that of the commander-in-chief of his commander-in-chief of his vast army. But what has brought this high military functionary to the door of the Vedic teacher this morning? Let us learn this from the conversation that followed upon the meeting of the two friends. Yajnadatta, my revered friend, I am sorry to disturb you in your duties, but I have come on a business which has some relation to your holy function. Yajnavalkya, I don't mind the interruption in the least. Apart from the great pleasure of seeing a friend like you, the transition is very easy from uttering the holy text to looking at a face shining with the glory of holy wisdom. But whom have you got with you here? Looking directly at the remarkably noble and beautiful face of the young man who had accompanied the general, Yajnadatta. It is for him that I come to you. This young man's name is Brahmagupta. He is a son of my honored friend Indragupta, the celebrated merchant of Banaras, whose name and fame you must have heard. I made his acquaintance when I visited Banaras under the king's orders about the time of the great assembly. Since that time, we have often met, and my family and his have been on the friendliest terms. He has now specially honored me by sending his favorite son Brahmagupta to be trained in our nitty under in our city under my care. He is now 18 and has already made considerable progress in Vedic studies. But your fame as a Vedic teacher has induced his father to send him here to complete his studies. He is to stop in this boarding house and learn all that he can do from you and your assistants. But he is also to devote a part of his time to learning the arts of war under our honored friend Vishnu Mitra. The reader must here be told that our friend Vishnu Mitra had also, like Yajna Datta, risen high by this time in the king's favor and was now the Dhanurvedacharya, the chief teacher of military arts in the Royal Military School of Mithila. However, the conversation between the two friends continued uninterrupted. Yajnavalkya, I am glad that Brahmagupta, though a Vaishya, has a liking for arts which are generally thought useful only to a Kshatriya. My opinion is that true wisdom consists not in merely acquiring professional knowledge, but in learning all that we need for our safety, happiness, and liberation. Hence, I feel specially gratified at my brother in law Maitreya's looking at a handsome looking and stoutly built young man standing near him, regularly attending Agni Mitra's classes in addition to his Vedic studies. Agni Mitra was Vishnu Mitra's younger brother and had charge of gymnastic exercises in the Royal Military School. He also taught archery to volunteers. He may never be in actual need of the arts he is learning, but his exercises are helping him, as you may see, in growing up to be a strong and healthy man. Looking again at Maitreyi with honest pride. Yajnavalkya. If I am very glad to hear of Maitreya's care of his body and his eagerness to learn our Kshatriya arts, I have often met him at his father's house and at the house of Vishnu Mitra in the company of the fine looking boys of that family, some of the best hopes of our military class. But who knew that the son of a Vedic teacher and the brother-in-law of another was growing up to be a warrior in his own way, smiling and looking at Maitreya. What do you say, Maitreya? Maitreya, taking the compliment with a bow and smile, I have no mind, sir, to take up any other profession than my father's, but the story I heard in my childhood of the saving of the life of my venerable teacher by your Excellency and the Dhanurvedacharya forcibly impressed me with the necessity of learning the arts that are improperly supposed to be necessary only for a Kshatriya, but which everyone ought to learn for his own health and safety. What would have become of my teacher and what might have become of my father but for your excellencies? Yes, Yajnadatta, I am glad to hear of your motives. In the case of Brahmagupta, however, the learning of military arts is a necessity. He is expected when he comes of age to accompany his father's goods of immense value from town to town and country to country and lead a convoy of archers and swordsmen for the protection of the merchandise from highway robbers. These men, especially those near about the Vindhya hills, and so bold and strenuous fighters that it sometimes acquires the most skilled warriors to vanquish them. Brahmagupta has need to be a good Kshatriya and a good Vaishya in one. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a gong near the school gate announcing that the time for dismissing the classes for the morning was very near. The friends stopped talking and went through a little business. Brahmagupta was duly admitted as a scholar, and the general took a hasty look at his bed and the other arrangements for his accommodation, inviting him to visit his house as often as would be Consistent with his duty as a scholar, the general took leave of his friends in the school and returned to his carries. So, thank you, my dear friends, for listening and watching this conversation. It's very, very knowledgeable. It's a story of a Vedic sage. So, thank you, my dear friends, for watching this. Please like the video, share the video, and comment. And please subscribe my channel. This is your own channel. This channel will bring the best Vedic, Advaitic, Vedanta knowledge, which is the need of the hour. Because our modern students, they have completely changed away from the our Sanatana culture. They are completely ignorant of our Sanatana culture. This is unfortunate. Let us all try to inculcate the ancient Sanatana Dharma culture and knowledge to one and all. Thanks, my dear friends. Thanks a lot. Thanks, thanks, thanks.